Hi everyone, this is Lizzie and you are watching The Curious Cat. Now, at some point or another, we're gonna talk about each of the Ninja Turtles, but we're gonna start with the one with the orange mask today. And in fact, we are gonna be also cooking some pumpkin today. We're going to be talking about Michelangelo. I know that everyone wants to know everything about Michelangelo, and maybe you think that you already do know everything about Michelangelo. However, maybe I can tell you a few things that you didn't know. So let's see. I have two kinds of pumpkin here, and I don't know which one to start with because my father-in-law brought me two pieces of two different kinds of pumpkin so I could decide which one I liked most, so he could then bring me a whole pumpkin, because that's something that happens in my family. So we're gonna go with a stringy one or the softer one. We'll go with the stringy one. Okay, so now Michelangelo is, as you know, very famous. He is like one of the most famous artists to live during the Renaissance period. He was also a bit of a... sorry. So, si può fare che uso le parolacce e poi fa pi, no? Michelangelo was a very famous artist of the Renaissance, as you know. He was also very famous in his own time. So it's one of the first cases in which we have really an artist who is a bit of a rock star, someone that is famous at the time in which he's living rather than just afterwards. And like many rock stars, he was a bit of a... So let's start from the beginning. Michelangelo comes from a family which actually... It wasn't a poor family. It was a family that was quite important. He was the son of a podestà. Now, first we need to explain what a podestà is. Now, basically, in the politics of Italy of those times, but already in the 1300s, we had politicians who, in most cases, especially in republics, we've talked about this also in other videos, maybe one day we'll make a video that talks specifically just about how the politics works in these republics in Italy. Usually politicians, people working in politics, weren't career politicians, okay? You'd have your day job, your normal job, and then for like a few months, you would end up like, along with a bunch of other people, ruling the city, and that was their idea of a democracy, okay? They'd literally often have like a box with a bunch of names in it, and you'd pick out the name and, okay, you're gonna rule along with another like 8 people, you're gonna rule the city for the next 2 months. Now, this meant that the people that were making the decisions were often people that had not really a lot of experience in this and had no idea what they're doing. Which is a little bit also with career politicians, I guess, but the concept was that you needed one person to have more experience in the leadership to help them in the decision-making, since it wasn't their main job working as a politician, okay? Now, this job was the job of the podestà. Now, the podestà would only, because the fear that people had was that people ruling would become corrupt, basically. So the fear was that people would get corrupted very easily. That's why you would only rule for a few months. And so even the podestà had to change regularly. Sometimes you would change every few years, for example. So you would be a podestà of one city, you'd be hired from that city to be the podestà. So the career politician, the one that's kind of helping out the people that are ruling in making the decisions and in leading the city, basically. And then you would move on to the next city. And ideally, you wouldn't have like personal relationships or relatives in that city so that you could be a good podestà. Now, if you were a successful podestà, if you were considered to be good at your job, you'd end up being the podestà of someone like Siena, for example, because you were considered to be very good in your career. If you sucked at your job, then you would end up being the podestà of Capraia, which is the reason why Michelangelo was born in Capraia, because his father sucked at his job, okay? So I'm telling you this because this is very important for Michelangelo's character. So he comes from a family which had a certain important position. So they from a position which was important, but had kind of fallen from grace. okay? And so his family, there's always this memory of a family which came from money, but ended up losing money along the way. And by the time he's born, like, the family is important and rich enough that the mother doesn't raise him, because that's what, like, only poor people had the mother that would like suckle the baby. If you were important and if you had money, you would send your child to be suckled by someone else. So you'd basically have a wet nurse, but rather than have the wet nurse live with you, often you would send the baby for the first few years to live with the wet nurse at her home. So you'd literally wouldn't see your baby for years, okay? So his family was still of a certain strata of society that's what happened. So he was sent off to live with a wet nurse. And in fact, he remembers this, he talks about this, because interestingly, the family of the wet nurse were all sculptors, were all marble sculptors. So he, in his memoirs, he says, I must have sucked powder of marble from the breast of my wet nurse because I had it running in my veins, which I think is very poetic. So yeah, so family fallen from grace, kind of important, but getting less and less important as we go. So he will spend his life trying to rebuild the name of the Buonarroti family, because he feels that it's his job as someone that is the most successful person coming from his family now to rebuild that, okay? This is going to be a very, very important theme throughout his life. I better actually cut this, all right? It's just bloody enormous. I don't know where to start. So yes, so a small age, he goes and lives with this wet nurse, then he comes back. As a teenager, straight away they realize that he has this great talent as an artist in general, not just as a sculptor. And he goes to work in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio. Domenico Ghirlandaio was a very successful artist of the Renaissance period in Florence. And he had a big, what's called a bottega, like a big workshop where a lot of pupils worked, because there wasn't art schools quite yet. So if you wanted to become an artist, you had to go and work in the workshop of an artist that was already kind of in the business, okay? And you would learn from that artist. Now, from this period, we already start to get an idea of what a difficult personality Michelangelo actually has, because it is said that he was obnoxious. Well, first of all, imagine, he was already really good. Like, he was one of those artists that is just already good at a very young age. So it is said that he was already better than his teacher, and then basically than the person working, running his workshop, which was Domenico. And so he would make fun of him. He would like do doodles that like portraits of him to, take the piss and stuff like that. So you can imagine that Domenico Ghirlandaio in very little time grew to kind of want to get rid of him. He couldn't stand him very, very early in this relationship, basically. It wasn't going very well. So luckily for Michelangelo, however, because I don't think he was getting much from this either, because he got so good that he kind of surpassed his teacher very fast. And Domenico Ghirlandaio was good, okay? Lawrence the Magnificent, Lorenzo de' Medici, who we will talk about in another video. I don't know if you remember, we did a video about the Medici family, talking about like the family tree in general, and then in later times we're going to talk about each of the most important members, dedicating a video to each one of them. So you can look at this video on the Medici family in general here, and then if you subscribe, you will know when we do a video specifically on Lawrence of the Medici family, Lawrence the Magnificent. So Lawrence the Magnificent is like one of the pioneers in the Renaissance of like one of the best people that invest in the arts. So he's putting a lot of money into the arts. He's commissioning a lot of artwork from artists, and he has his own little kind of school where he goes and he goes around, finds his like little prodigies, the people that he thinks are going to be amazing, and he brings them back and he inserts them into this school where he has them all trained within the walls of, like, within a garden within his palace, okay, in the center of Florence. So he discovers Michelangelo and he says, you are coming with me, because he can see already that this artist is going to be amazing. And Michelangelo actually goes to live with Lawrence the Magnificent. Lawrence the Magnificent, you know, cottons on very fast to the fact that Michelangelo is going to be a star. So he goes to live with the Medici. And Lawrence actually has a son of a similar age, which is John of the Medici. This is important because John will later on become a cardinal. Not that later. He becomes a cardinal when he's a teenager, which is, you know, crazy. And then later he will become Pope Leo X, who we also mentioned on another video, you know, the one with the, you know, baby covered in gold. Yeah, that one. So he spends some time with the Medici family. He lives there. He trains in this garden where there's all these beautiful sculptures, because you have to imagine that the Renaissance artist needs to look at statues from the Greco-Roman antiquity to learn. It's not like we have people posing or we have a teacher teaching you, like all the methods that you have in art schools today. We didn't have those yet. So the main important thing was to have access to a lot of ancient Greek and ancient Roman statues to copy from. And that is something that Lawrence the Magnificent could afford, and which he supplied to artists like Michelangelo, which were training kind of in this little school he'd set up. So he trains there, he lives there for a while, and he obviously, you can imagine, Lawrence the Magnificent is so important to him because he did so much for him. Then Lawrence the Magnificent dies. This is, oh, by the way, I didn't give you any dates yet, did I? So 1475 is when Michelangelo is born. In 92 is when Lawrence the Magnificent dies, and the Medici family is kind of really thrown off, because after Lawrence the Magnificent, we don't really have someone that's as powerful as him and is magnetic as him to take over. And so within a few years, the Medici are actually kicked out. And we'll talk about this again more in another video, but all you need to know now is that the Medici are kicked out of Florence, and they will be in exile for 18 years, okay? During these 18 years, at this point, the Medici are just, in theory, they are just merchants, but in practice, they are really the ones ruling behind closed doors, you could say. So the Medici are exiled for 18 years, and during these 18 years, Florence becomes a real republic. What I mean is that before it was a democracy on paper, but not really. Now, during these years, it is really a democracy. It is really taking its own decisions, and it's not being influenced by the Medici making actual decisions behind closed doors. During these years, initially, Michelangelo goes back to live with his dad. And then he travels. He actually spends some time in Rome. In Rome, he gets some very important commissions. We have, for example, we have a cardinal, which is Cardinal della Rovere, who is one of the most important people in his life, because he's the first one to really believe in him and get him a load of gigs. From this period, there's actually one of my favorite statues from Michelangelo, which is like a Bacchus, so the god of wine, basically. And you can really see how he is inspired by the Greco-Roman antiquity, but he's also doing his own twist, okay? So this Bacchus doesn't look like this perfect Greek statue of someone which is perfect from every standpoint, both aesthetic and psychologically, right? This is a Bacchus who's drunk. Like, you can literally see that this boy is drunk and he's kind of like this. And it's, for the fashion of the time, it was very interesting, but also a little bit unnerving, okay? Even today, when you see it, it's a little bit like, it's supposed to be this god, and it's not that drunk that it's being funny. It's just drunk enough that you're a little bit like, this is a bit weird, but in a really cool way. Does that make sense? So I really love this statue. The cardinal that commissions it, however, does not like this statue. And in fact, it's very interesting because this is such a famous work of art, which the person that commissioned it ended up selling it to someone else because he didn't want it for himself. So during this period, he starts to get a lot of gigs. He starts to make a name for himself. And this is when he does maybe the work that really launches him, which is the Pietà. If you've been to Rome and you've been to the Vatican, or now actually you have to have two different tickets, one for the Vatican Museum and one for the Basilica. It's in the Basilica. So, you know, the famous Pietà by Michelangelo, which was actually done for a French cardinal's tomb. The famous one where we have this beautiful Madonna, which is a young Madonna, and she's sitting down and she has the body of Christ in her arms. This is really the launch of his career. After this, he becomes really famous. He gets a lot of gigs. And for example, he goes to Siena. In Siena, he does he's commissioned to do the tomb of Pope Pius II. We will talk a lot about Pope Pius II because he is so cool in another video. He gets the commission to do not the tomb, sorry, the funerary monument inside the Cathedral of Siena. And here we start to see one of the reoccurring factors of Michelangelo's life, which will be taking all the commissions that he's offered and getting paid in advance for a load of stuff and then not actually doing it. This is something that we're gonna see a lot. Michelangelo is always wanting to make more money. He accepts all the gigs, okay? He's like, yeah, I'll do it. And then he doesn't have time to do it all. And he's just trying to get his hands on as much money as possible. He's a little bit, it's almost like he's quite greedy, but he doesn't actually spend the money on himself, okay? We will see at the end of the video how he dies, and wait until the end of the video for the big surprise, which you will get from his death, okay? But he does not spend that money on himself. He's not someone he does not go to party. He does not know how to party, okay? He's also obnoxious, so no one really wants to party with him. He doesn't spend money on his clothing, he's just not someone that knows how to enjoy life. He just knows how to express himself through work and through sculpture. He's obsessed, okay? And he's also obsessed in collecting money to build up the fortune of the Buonarroti family, okay? And he's putting it aside and investing it in real estate. So he does invest a lot of the money in real estate, again, to build up the Buonarroti family fortune, okay? So he is commissioned to do this big funerary monument for Pope Pius II. He actually ends up doing only 2 statues. So if you go there, there are 4 statues, like little statues, and the rest someone else has to do because he ain't doing it. Why? Because whilst he's doing that, he gets another commission, which is a lot more, and he knows this is going to be a very important commission for his career. He gets commissioned with the David. So he's like, bye Siena, goes to Florence, and he goes to Florence to work on this massive piece of marble. So you have to think that getting a massive piece of marble out of the mountain and bringing it all the way to Florence isn't easy, okay, with the equipment of that time. So when people were able to get such a big piece of marble in one piece, they're not going to give up on it that easily. I'm saying this because this was a defected piece of marble. It was a piece of marble that had some issues with it, so much so that 2 sculptors before Michelangelo had attempted to work on it and given up. However, like, as I said, not easy to come by such a big piece of marble, so we're not just going to be like, well, we'll cut it up into pieces or whatever. Then Michelangelo comes along, and he can do anything. Like, there's nothing that can stop him from doing anything at all. So he attempts to sculpt this defected piece of marble and is very successful. Now, a very important thing to understand about this sculpture is that it has a very, very strong political value, okay? First of all, do you remember what's just happened in Florence? The Medici has been kicked out, and now we are in a republic, Okay, so who commissions this to Michelangelo? It is the Republic of Florence that commissions this to Michelangelo. This sculpture, which originally was commissioned to go like at the very top of the Duomo, and it would have been like all the way up there. But as it's being done, the people of Florence are like, no, this is way too cool. This, we're going to have to give it a lot more value. We're going to give it a much better position. So it ends up becoming the symbol of the democracy, of the republic, okay? Now, the story of David, I don't know if you guys all recall it from the Bible, but David is a young boy who David is a young boy who has to fight against a big giant, which is Goliath. Okay, Goliath, massive giant, very difficult to fight against. David, young boy with just a slingshot and a stone. But with that, and with the Lord, is able to kill the Goliath with one shot with a stone right in the head, and he dies and whatever. So the Republic of Florence choose David, and this is not just with this sculpture. This was already something that we see before. There's another Ninja Turtle that did another David, which we can talk about in another episode, which was already like symbolic of the people of Florence, okay? So the people of Florence are the young boy, which is smaller and weaker in front of the big giant, which is the Medici, but are able to win against the big baddie, okay? So if you go to Florence, the David, or the copy of the David today, the original is in the Accademia Gallery, but the original used to be where the copy is today, right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, which is the government building where the decisions were made, where the democratic decisions were made, okay? So David is at the entrance of the place where the decisions are made, guarding the entrance. So he is the hero of the people, guarding the entrance from Goliath, from people like the Medici, so they can never enter again, which they will do later, but they don't know that yet, okay? So remember that the Medici made Michelangelo in many ways, okay? So imagine what they are feeling when they're seeing him becoming like the sculptor of the symbol of the democracy, of the republic, you know, and making the sculpture which is so directly referred to, you know, getting rid of the Medici. This will become important later. Okay, so it has a very political tone to it, this sculpture, and it really launches his career enormously. And he's very smart because he knows what people want from him at this point. What people want from him is a crowd pleaser. In fact, when people think of Michelangelo, they think of the David. However, when I do my tours, I always want to underline, I'm going to cut myself here. So cut myself on camera, that will make it interesting. When I do my tours, I always explain that the David is not the most representative sculpture of Michelangelo's style, okay? Think of the Bacchus. Look at the Bacchus. Giacomo, insert it right here. Look at the Bacchus and think of the David. They're totally different from one another, okay? Two naked, beautiful men standing, but in a totally different style. The David is done to please the crowds, okay? What do you need to do to please the crowds at this time? You need to do something that looks just like an ancient Greek or Roman statue. And that is what he does. The position that the David has in this sculpture is what we call a chiastic position or a contrapposto, okay? So I think I'm going to have to model it for you, aren't I? All right. So basically we have a no, it's like this. Okay, so he's standing with this leg here is holding all the weight of the body and is in tension, okay? This leg over here is relaxed, all right? This arm is relaxed, this arm is in tension. So there's a contraposition between the limbs which are in tension and the limbs which are relaxed. It forms almost like an X if you connect the limbs which are in tension and the limbs which are relaxed. Now, this is something that the ancient Greeks had figured out is a great way to create kind of like movement and something interesting in a position which is otherwise static. Okay, so rather than have someone stand like this, which is tremendously boring, you have them stand like this, which makes it a lot more interesting. Okay, so he takes that position and he proposes it to the modern public, and he really does this sculpture that looks so like an ancient Greek statue. Nothing had been done so big also since the times of the Romans in a marble statue. Okay, so people lose their shit. Okay, they go crazy over this, and they're so proud of it, because you have to remember that these cities, they recognize themselves in the artwork, in the architecture, in the sculpture. They identify with it. So it's also a way for Florence to show off, basically. Look at what we've got here. Okay, so people go crazy. It becomes a very famous piece of work very soon. They decide to give it this special position in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, and this really launches his career. As I said, he knows that he needs to do something which will please the crowds with this, and he does. Okay, after this, his success is enormous. It takes him very little time to make it as well. It takes him about 3 years. We're at the turn of the century, okay, 1501 to 1504, I believe it's the years in which he makes this. And after this, it's like he becomes so famous that he's called here and there and everywhere. He's called also to Rome during this period to paint the Sistine Chapel. Now, Michelangelo, great painter, does not really want to be a painter, okay? He wants to sculpt, all right? However, Pope Julius II, nicknamed also the Warrior Pope, is not the kind of Pope you say no to, okay? So he ends up having to go and paint this, the Sistine Chapel in Rome, which you also can go and see. And it is very hard for him. These are very hard years for him. He does not enjoy it, to be perfectly honest. He's also a very difficult person to work with. So the people that work with him, because he doesn't really have a lot of experience of doing frescoes, which is quite difficult to do, okay? Plus, knowing how to do frescoes in those days, knowing how to do a fresco in Florence and knowing how to do a fresco in Rome, two very different things, because the materials were different and the conditions were different. And since with a fresco, you start with literally a wet wall, and then you have to paint it really fast, because everything that's wet has to be painted by the end of the day before it dries. Otherwise, you have to start all over again. So the conditions of the specific place where you're painting influence how you need to behave enormously. So he's having a very hard time doing these frescoes. He's not enjoying it at all, okay? Very difficult years for him, and everyone that works with him on this hates him by the end of it, because he's so difficult to work with. There also were some unhappy people of how they were paid for helping him in this. So not great years for him or for anyone that has anything to do with him. However, it does again put another enormous feather in his enormous cap, because it is one of the things that he's most famous for is the Sistine Chapel, and it's definitely also one of the symbols of the Renaissance. I mean, people come from all over Europe. In those days, when Michelangelo is still alive, we have the first forms of tourism of people coming from different parts of the world, of Europe, to see the Sistine Chapel and other works by Michelangelo. I mean, he's literally attracting tourists when he's still alive. True rock star, the very first rock star of Italy, okay? In Florence, for example, we will even have artists like Giambologna. Giambologna came from Flanders. His name was Jean Boulogne, but the Italians couldn't pronounce it, so they nicknamed him Giambologna. He moved to Florence just so he could be near, like this, breathe the same air breathed by Michelangelo, and learn from looking at the work of Michelangelo. And he became a great sculptor, for example, in Florence. So his career is going incredibly well. His personal life sucks. Okay, he has a few friends, very close ones, but he's just so difficult to deal with, and it's always like he's in turmoil. You know, I forgot to mention before that during those years in which he is living with Lawrence the Magnificent and working in that garden, that little art school, that's when he gets his nose broken, for example, from a fight with one of the other pupils as a teenager. So he's always getting into, you know, into discussions, into fights. He's just very, very difficult person, and very he has an internal turmoil which is very, very strong, let's say. Now, do you remember that I told you he's always trying to, and successfully getting out of doing works that he's being commissioned and sometimes already got a deposit on and stuff like that? So one of the ways that he gets out of doing this stuff is by using Pope Julius II, because I told you Pope Julius II is like the warrior pope, kind of someone that you don't want to be on the wrong side of. Pope Julius II is always getting, because he's doing work for him, he's always getting Michelangelo out of having to respect his word, to stand by his word and respect contracts that he's started with people that commission works. I find this incredibly ironic, because this will be exactly what will happen to Julius II after his death. What I mean is that Julius II commissions this incredible work to Michelangelo, which will be his tomb. Now, this tomb is like the one that should have been, is like nothing else you can imagine, all right? Julius II thought of himself more as a Roman emperor than a pope. So he wanted a tomb that looked just like the Roman emperor's tombs. Now, the Roman emperor's tombs would often have sculptures of slaves holding the whole damn thing up, all right? Because the slaves represented the slaves where you could recognize where they were from, okay? And they represented the lands that the emperor had conquered, okay? So if that emperor had conquered a certain part of Germany, you would have slaves dressed in that way to show, like, these are the slaves that I got because I conquered that part of Germany, okay? This pope wants a burial in that way, with slaves holding it up, okay? Some of those slaves, or like what would have been those slaves, because they were started and not finished, are actually in the corridor in the Accademia leading up to the David. So when you visit the Accademia in Florence and you go see the David, those sculptures leading up to him, those should have been in Rome in the tomb of Julius II. However, once Julius II is dead, Michelangelo's like, I don't care anymore. I mean, the new pope doesn't give a toss about him not actually making it. The family of Julius II will be running after Michelangelo to get him to respect his contract for generations. And they will end up with this little, like a tenth of what he was actually supposed to do and was paid for, okay? And as I said, the part of it isn't even there. Part of it, of what he did, is in Florence. So I find that very ironic that Julius II got a taste of his own medicine after his death. He thought he was going to have this incredible tomb, and then he didn't really get much at all. So now this video's been going for quite a while, so I think I'm gonna make this a two-parter, and in the next video I'm gonna tell you what happens, the drama that happens when Michelangelo goes back to Florence. And you know who else decides to go back to Florence? The Medici. When the Medici get back to Florence and find that Michelangelo has been an incredible supporter of the Republic, the democracy that kicked them out, what do you think will happen? Drama, drama, drama. So, and he is gonna see again a friend from childhood in a totally different situation, and let's see what comes of that in the next episode, the second installment of Michelangelo, the Ninja Turtle.